being a Baylor fan, we hear so many great stories of the almost not quite. This guy was so close to coming to Baylor. It's usually football, right? LaDainian Tomlinson was in our own backyard right here at University High in Waco, and they let him go to TCU. There was a scrawny young quarterback from Austin Westlake in the late 90s who wanted to go to Baylor, really wanted to go to Baylor. And the Bears told him he was too short. And granted, he was pretty short, but then he led Purdue to the Rose Bowl, and then he won a Super Bowl. And then in a couple of years, he's going to be in Canton, Ohio in the Hall of Fame. That's Drew Brees. And Earl Campbell was really considering Baylor. He loved Grant Taft. We were basically second on the list. But of course, he goes to UT. It's the 70s. And he wins the Heisman Trophy. He's one of the greatest running backs ever to play the game. There's so many stories like this for Baylor. And now, because they are starting to attract great basketball players, we're going to start to hear it for basketball too. And one of them is a guy who is cementing his legacy as a college basketball great. And he has been open in the past about talking about just how close he was to playing for Scott Drew and the Baylor Bears. I'm talking about Zach Edey, the 7'4" superstar for Purdue, who is going to be the second year in a row. He's going to be the National Player of the Year, and has finally kind of gotten the monkey off his back, so to speak, by getting Purdue past the first weekend and now past the second weekend. They will be playing in the Final Four this very weekend. And Baylor, thankfully, has had enough success in the regular season anyway, the last couple of years, that we haven't been sitting here thinking, oh, if only we had Zach Edey. But now, on April 2nd of 2024, when it's 3 straight round of 32 exits and Zach Edey's now playing in the Final Four, you start to think that a little bit. When Purdue was going out in the first round to a 16 seed, you weren't thinking about it. But now you're thinking about it. I certainly am. He'd already have a national championship ring and probably another one, if we're being honest. There are people who don't like the way Zach Edey plays. There are some people who think, that's not how the game is played anymore with the big, relatively unathletic. He's still a good athlete. And you see that and you think, well, it's not played through 7-foot centers anymore, right? And I understand that. I thought that. I thought this was more of a guard-driven college basketball. At least it was in the last couple of years when Baylor was winning big in it. But the more I look at that, the more I think maybe that's not the case. And I think that because I saw an interesting tweet from a great basketball mind, Frank Martin, who has knocked Baylor out of the tournament before and led South Carolina to the Final Four, was at Kansas State for years before Bruce Weber, and also is now turning around UMass. I'm just saying. But he had a tweet the other night that said, this is interesting. I look at Purdue, a team that plays through their center more than pretty much anybody in the country offensively, and they're going to the Final Four. UConn, they play through their center. They're in the Final Four. This was still back in the Elite Eight, by the way. Alabama attacks the rim with their centers. Not a great defensive team, but they play through the center. They're in the Final Four. Duke plays through their center. NC State definitely plays through their center, and they're going to the Final Four. So maybe we are reverting back a little bit as college basketball as a whole. It is going back to playing through the big guy. And a big reason why is the success that Zach Edey is having right now at Purdue. Because a couple years ago, when it was Luka Garza, a similar kind of player, he was playing at Iowa, it was still guard-driven, and they couldn't even get to the Sweet 16. But now that might be starting to change. Baylor is a team that is one of the quintessential college basketball teams that is guard-driven, and they can't get out of the first weekend anymore. So, all that to say, boy, it's not from a lack of trying. It's not like anyone at Baylor did anything wrong, but you do start to think, I wonder what it would be like to have to have Zach Edey in there. And Mike Carmen, who writes for Gold and Black for Purdue, had this great story that came out. It was a few months ago, but it's all about Zach Edey and his recruitment. And he's a Canadian kid. He was playing down in Florida for IMG, and it talks about how his mom was so happy that he's able to wear shorts. Don't have to find pants for him. This 7-footer, high school kid, he gets to wear shorts all the time. And they visited Purdue, and his mom is saying, Zach got off the plane. I looked at him and he's wearing shorts. It's October and I'm shaking my head. And I looked at Zach and said, buddy, it's really cold here. And he said, I forgot what state I'm in. And as the conversation continued, Julia asked Zach about living in a region with 4 seasons again instead of summer the whole year round like he gets in Florida. And she said, well, he's a Canadian boy. And Zach told me, yeah, I kind of miss winter. Does that not drive you crazy? As someone from the Northeast, it drives me crazy because sometimes I do feel like that. But to think that we might have missed out on a guy because he liked the winter and we don't have that, as long as they do anyway, that must make your blood boil. Like, oh my God, I can't believe we missed that. Now, they do say in the article, it wasn't just the weather thing, but that Zach Edey almost didn't even make the recruiting trip to Purdue because he had his mind set. He went to Purdue and did the recruiting trip basically because his mom asked him to. But he said, quote, I was really close to being a Baylor Bear. If my mom didn't talk me out of it on the visit, I probably would have gone. At the time, I had no Purdue offer, and they weren't really in the picture. If Zach Edey is cutting down the nets in Phoenix, not using a ladder, that quote is going to just hit like a cold wind in Indianapolis in January. Because Baylor was hard on his recruiting trail. Like, Scott was one of the first to offer him, if not the first. They were given the full sell. Scott and Jacobs and Tang and Brooks, all of them, they were giving the full sell to Zach Edey. And they'll probably won't ever talk about it, but I would love to hear what the Baylor coaches had to say about that recruitment because they were so close. They were so close. And I don't know why Zach Edey's mom loved Purdue so much. Maybe she didn't love the religious angle of Baylor. I don't know, but it was that close. That close. And it might be one that we look back on and think, what could have been? You got another national championship in there. Like, Edey was an impact player as a sophomore, like a all Big Ten kind of player as a sophomore, which is the great, like, what if team for Baylor in 2022. Obviously, 2020 is a great what if team because they didn't have in the tournament. But 22, they didn't play healthy that whole year, or except for the first 15 games. So they were 15-0 and number 1 in the country. That team could have absolutely been in the Final Four with someone like Zach Edey on there. And again, not taking anything away from that team. They dealt with the injuries they had, what they had, and Jonathan Chachua had an excellent year. But platooning Edey in there, terrific. Last year's team, I'm not saying Final Four, but a totally different team. Totally different team. And this year, you might not have Yves Missi, which stinks. I love having Yves Missi. Don't get me wrong. But you've also got a National Player of the Year player in Zach Edey. Just what could have been. I wouldn't trade these regular seasons the last couple of years, but certainly now seeing Zach Edey in the Final Four and Baylor out in the round of 32 again, it definitely makes you think. And I wonder if he would have gone down as one of the what ifs, but he could technically come back for another year of college basketball. He says he's not going to. He's going to get picked at the end of the first round, but who knows? Maybe Baylor can sweeten the pot and get him here as a grad transfer for 1 year and say, hey, let's, you've had this heartbreaking loss in the national semifinals to DJ Burns and NC State. Why don't we go and win the whole thing if you come here to Baylor? Probably not. Probably not. But boy, what could have been?